Greetings, I'm Nick Reveles, and this is OperaTalk. We're here at the Museum of San Diego History, under the auspices of the San Diego Historical Society, to discuss the next opera in San Diego Opera's International Season 2000. We've been happily ensconced in the world of great composers like Mozart, Verdi, Wagner, and Puccini this season, but now it's time for something completely different. We at San Diego Opera are terribly proud of the fact that over our 35 years of existence, we've been able to feature operas by contemporary composers. 20th century hard hitters like Sergei Prokofiev, Heinz Werner Henze, Benjamin Britten, local composer Myron Fink, Mexican composer Daniel Catan, and others. Well, it's very rare that we have the opportunity to listen to a piece that was written practically yesterday. Such is the case with today's opera. Based on the great American stage play by Tennessee Williams, today we're going to discuss Andre Previn's A Streetcar Named Desire. Let's spend a few minutes talking about Tennessee Williams. He was born in Mississippi and is considered by many America's greatest playwright. He's certainly the greatest playwright that came out of the South. His mother was the daughter of an Episcopalian minister, his father a traveling shoe salesman from a prestigious but down-on-its-luck Tennessee family. His father was an alcoholic and extremely abusive, and in this familial adversity, Tennessee and his sister Rose found each other coming very close together for sustenance and nurturing. After William's mother forced a frontal lobotomy on his sister Rose after her first stirrings of sexuality, Tennessee took care of her, in fact, until his death in 1983. Williams never remembered not writing, and in fact some of his short stories were published in the 1920s. He had various brushes with higher education, finally graduating from the University of Iowa in 1938. In 1939, he won a theater prize for his play American Blues, and in the same year, a Rockefeller grant for $1,000, which gave him the time and the space to really spend on his writing. He wrote during this time the play Battle of Angels, which he later revised into Orpheus Descending. His first great success was The Glass Menagerie. This was Williams' so-called memory play about a fragile young woman, Laura, and her mother and her older brother, who was certainly a stand-in for Tennessee Williams himself, and they wait for the expected gentleman caller. The play opened in Chicago and didn't do too well with audiences until two Chicago critics took the play under their wings and constantly promoted in their writings. Finally, it was a great success, and the fame and fortune that was due to Tennessee Williams finally came his way. Streetcar followed, and then Summer and Smoke, The Rose Tattoo, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, and Camino Real, all great American plays. In his plays, he tries to recreate the South that he loved and that he lived in for so many years. A South with all of its gentility, with its manners and its morals, with its strange and damaged eccentric characters. Many of these characters based on people that he knew and that he lived with. It's the language of the South that creates the music of these plays, moving these characters into perfectly structured scenes. It's all the more tragic then that his later works were considered uneven, splintered memories of a great talent gone sour due to dependence on booze and drugs. He was also a homosexual, living an openly gay lifestyle 20 or 30 years before that was more generally accepted by the public. Surely all of these elements in his life kept his works from gaining a broader audience. Tennessee Williams died disoriented, swallowing a medicine bottle cap that he mistook for a sleeping pill late at night at the Hotel Elysee in February 1983. With his death died one of the greatest voices of the American theater. After the success of Glass Menagerie, Williams traveled to the lazy resort town of Lake Chapala near Guadalajara, Mexico for a vacation, but to also begin writing the play that would eventually become Streetcar. Often for Williams, plays began as a kind of mental image or a sentence from someone dropped in conversation, perhaps a line from a poem. In this case, he had a very specific image of a young woman sitting in a window with folded hands, moonlight streaming into the window, and she's waiting in vain for her boyfriend. This image eventually begat the play that he variously called The Moth, Blanche's Chair in the Moon, and The Poker Night. It wasn't until he moved to New Orleans and rented an apartment on Royal Street that he began to get the image for the streetcar. He noticed up and down Royal Street, streetcars in New Orleans, one named Desire, another named Cemeteries. And he realized that the clash at the center of the play would be between desire and death. Symbolizing desire, of course, would be this faded Southern belle, Blanche, who lived in a world of illusions. And symbolizing cemeteries or death would be her brother-in-law, Stanley Kowalski, who brutally crushed these illusions at every turn. Well, casting for the premiere of A Streetcar Named Desire was crucial to Williams. He wanted just the right two actors for the proper electricity between these two volatile characters. For Blanche, he really hoped for Betty Davis, Margaret Sullivan. Even at one point, Mary Martin was considered for the role. He desperately wanted John Garfield as Stanley, but Garfield wasn't available. He was too busy with films at the time. But Burt Lancaster and Gregory Peck were also considered for the role. Well, it wasn't until Williams traveled to Hollywood to see a trio of his one-acts at the Actors Lab that he discovered the wonderful American actress Jessica Tandy. He felt that only she could truly recreate Blanche on the stage. For Stanley, his agent, Audrey Wood, or her husband, suggested a young 23-year-old actor who had had 4 or 5 bit roles on Broadway, came out of the drama workshop at the New School. His name, Marlon Brando. Brando traveled to Provincetown, Massachusetts in the summer of 1947 to read for Tennessee Williams. Brando gave a reading as Stanley Kowalski that absolutely knocked Tennessee Williams off his feet. It's no understatement to say that Brando's performance as Stanley Kowalski completely revolutionized American theater. No one could look at the craft of stage acting the same way again. The premiere, December 3rd, 1947, at the Ethel Barrymore Theater on Broadway in New York, was an unqualified success. The audience roundly applauded this piece for nearly 30 minutes. One of the critics for the New York Daily News said that it was heart-wrenchingly human and that it had the overtones of grand opera. Now, the themes at the center of Streetcar are somewhat complicated, but the story itself is relatively simple. A faded Southern belle, 30 years old, Blanche DuBois, comes from Mississippi and travels to New Orleans to visit her sister Stella and her sister's brutal husband, Stanley. While there, her affectations and her attempts to hide her secret past are cruelly revealed and belittled by Stanley. His poker buddy, Mitch, attempts to court Blanche, and she sees in him the possibility for one more chance at gentility, one more opportunity to redeem her questionable sexual history. The climax of the play is her rape by Stanley, an act which violates not only her body but her mind. At the end of the play, completely mentally undone, as a psychiatrist and his nurse come to take her away to an asylum, she says that she has always been dependent on the kindness of strangers. Streetcar begins with ominous jazz-inflected chords that introduce us immediately to the fragile, illusionary world of Blanche DuBois, who is, of course, at the center of this opera. The chords sound like this. You can't really get the true flavor of these chords on the piano, but I'll try and play just a few of the bars in the beginning of the opera to give you an idea of what this atmosphere is like. You'd think that those chords are like a leitmotif. Now, we've talked about leitmotifs in terms of Wagner. Other composers use them, where an idea, a musical idea like this, like those two chords, are brought back at certain points in the story. And these chords do recur in the fabric of the opera, but they don't recur with any rhyme or reason. Now, here they are at the beginning of the opera as we meet Blanche and she arrives in New Orleans. A little later on in the scene, she comes to the Kowalskis' apartment and is confronted by the upstairs neighbor, Eunice. She asks Eunice if this is the Kowalski apartment. The woman says yes, stays a little too long, and Blanche says, "I'd rather be alone." And we get the chords again. Now, if you're listening very carefully, the chords are slightly different. They never appear in the same key. They're always just a little bit different, a little bit developed, but you can tell that they're essentially the same idea which opened the opera. Later on in the scene, Blanche's sister, Stella, appears. She comes into the apartment. She turns on the light. Blanche says, no, turn the light off. And then she greets her sister, Stella, Stella for star, my little baby sister. And we hear the chords again. This time we heard something a little extra up top in the winds to decorate the chords just a little bit and make them slightly different. What's interesting is at the very end of the opera, when Blanche is taken away to a mental institution by a doctor and his nurse, and she sings that famous line, "Whoever you are, I have always depended on the kindness of strangers," we get the chords again at the very end. Listen. She sings again, "Whoever you are," and then the last two bars of the opera. Our chords again. There are various ideas like these chords throughout the fabric of the piece. And again, they don't recur with any kind of rhyme nor reason. Here's another idea played in the trumpets in the orchestra. It's like a little tattoo or a fanfare. It's very simple. But it comes back a number of times throughout the fabric of the piece. Here, for instance, where Stella describes to Blanche her husband, Stanley Kowalski, whom she first met when he was in the Army Corps of Engineers. I'll speak the lines rather than sing them for you. Blanche, you can't describe someone you're in love with. Here's a picture of him. There he is. Master, Sergeant, in the Army Corps of Engineers. Now that's another idea that is rather like a leitmotif, but unlike a leitmotif, it's not attached to any person, object, thing, or psychological state in the opera. If Wagner had used that little idea, for instance, this little trumpet fanfare, and attached it, say, to Brunhilde's joy of reuniting with her Valkyrie sisters, we'd always get that idea when she speaks of her joy. That doesn't happen in Streetcar. What we've got is a lot of little ideas like that that seem to recur in a random fashion. I suspect that Previn is placing the audience in the mind of Blanche DuBois. Now think about this. She's this, again, fragile Southern belle who is filled with illusions and with memories, sometimes distant memories that feel very present to her, of her dead husband, of men that she's made objects of her sexual desire. She's filled with guilt and loss and grief, and she's on the verge of a mental collapse. The fabric of the piece is rather like that kind of a mind. Blanche remembering these ideas, things coming to her, recurring in a random fashion. It really places us in the place of Blanche, and we're experiencing the entire piece, Streetcar, as if we were Blanche. And then at the very end of the opera, everything is tied up in a wonderful circle by representing those jazzy, brassy, almost big band-like chords. The very end. Streetcar the Opera came as an idea of Lotfi Mansouri, the general director of San Francisco Opera. He had seen a production of the play in Los Angeles a few years before, and was so struck by the potential of the piece as an opera. He approached various composers, among them Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Sondheim. They both thought, however, that Streetcar didn't need music. When he approached Andre Previn, he got an immediate positive response. According to Previn, he said to Mansouri, "I would jump off a building for that project." Well, he didn't have to be quite that drastic, but he did approach the project with librettist Philip Littell, who had written the libretto for Conrad Susa's Dangerous Liaisons, also a commission of San Francisco Opera. To everyone concerned, it seemed a great match. This terrific American jazz pianist, conductor, composer, a man who had worked in Hollywood for so many years, writing film scores for Elmer Gantry and A Long Day's Journey into Night, and matching him with the great American property, theater property, Williams' Streetcar Named Desire. But he had to make a lot of controversial choices in approaching this play. First of all, Previn decided to ignore all of the musical cues that are so important to Williams, not only in this play, but in all of his dramas. He loved music. And so throughout the play, you have, dotting the landscape of the play, rather like Wagnerian leitmotifs, musical cues that are sometimes very specific, like Paper Doll, or It's Only a Paper Moon, played very quietly at one point or another. During Blanche's monologue, where she talks about the suicide of her young husband, he insists that the Polish dance, the Warszawiana, be played quietly underneath her monologue. Previn ignores all of these musical cues, even the cues that suggest that we should hear blues piano or a jazz band heard from the bar down the street, wafting into the Kowalski's apartment. Not at all. Previn felt that if he did this, it would be rather like setting the play to music, and he wanted Streetcar to be an opera. Another rather interesting and I think controversial choice was his decision not to use, in any overt way, jazz. Now, he has a terrific background as a jazz man, Previn, as a pianist, as an arranger of jazz standards. But he very stubbornly insists on not using it in any obvious way. Of course, it's in the fabric of the piece. He can't get away from that. It's part of his background, musically, as a musician as well as an American. Previn's choice, then, I think, is important, not to inflect it too much with jazz, simply because the story takes place in New Orleans. I think it's a very important decision, and it helps the opera to stand on its own. These may seem like stubborn choices, but they're good choices as far as Previn is concerned in helping the opera stand apart from another extremely important piece of American art, the play itself. The librettist, too, had a difficult job lifting the play outside of 50 years of cultural overlay, kitsch, camp, of meanings that some of the lines and images of the play have taken on through many years of retelling and reproduction of the story. For instance, lines like, "Whoever you are, I have always depended on the kindness of strangers," or "We've had this date from the very beginning." And Marlon Brando standing outside of the apartment, shrieking out at the top of his lungs, "Stella, Stella." All of these concepts, these lines and ideas have taken on something of a myth, and Littell had to separate these ideas from the myth in order for the opera to really float. You would think, with all of these problems, that Littell and Previn would run screaming from the property as quickly as possible, but they didn't. They persevered and they prevailed. The premiere of Streetcar the Opera was on September 19th, 1998 in San Francisco. The audience was wildly enthusiastic, but the critics were somewhat mixed, lukewarm actually. Many of the criticisms surrounded this cultural overlay. I think as I read the reviews, I realized that, well, this critic is looking at Streetcar the Opera through many, many years of myth and kitsch and camp, and not separating the opera from the play. I think it will take many years before we can really see this opera stand on its own as a masterpiece of American operatic theater. Another criticism that I'd like to refer to is that Previn never gave the character of Stanley an aria to sing. Well, think about it. In this opera, we're looking at Stanley Kowalski through Blanche's eyes. She sees him as an ape, a brute, an artless man who has no manners or morals. He's an active character, not a reflective one. And reflective characters sing arias. It's a very important and a good decision, I think, quite an appropriate decision for Previn not to allow Stanley to let loose vocally or to have an aria. On the other hand, there are beautiful arias in this opera for Mitch, for Stella, and for Blanche, and we're about to hear one of them now. San Diego Opera Ensemble tenor Kevin St. Clair and music director Mia Im at the piano will perform Mitch's second act aria. This is the point where Mitch has just brought Blanche home from a date, and he presents himself as a potential object for her desire. He talks a little bit about his mother and how she would like to meet Blanche, and then he offers himself to her. Mia Im at the piano, Kevin St. Clair, tenor, Mitch's aria.
I'm not a boy, she says. I'm not getting any younger, she says. I know it's true that her time is running out. She wants to know you, Blanche. She wants to know you. just do it. That is all there is to love, to true love. But sometimes, when you lose the one you love, your one true love, what do? You still believe in love, no matter who you are, no matter what you've been through, you still need to love.
Now, this is the point in OperaTalk where we always like to give you recommendations for recordings of the works that we're talking about. That's really easy today because there's only one recording of Streetcar. It was a recording made during that world premiere performance in 1998 in San Francisco. It's a brilliant recording with Blanche DuBois being played by Renee Fleming, a wonderful American soprano, Stanley Kowalski, Rodney Gilfrey, baritone, Elizabeth Futrell plays the role of Stella, and as Mitch, Anthony Dean Griffey. It's so helpful to come to the theater and really know the piece. I know there will be people out there who will come to it without knowing it and leave wishing they had. Here's your opportunity. Get this recording now. Become familiar with it so that you can truly appreciate the beauty of this American classic. A Streetcar Named Desire, the opera, is a sensitive recreation of an American theater classic. I know you'll be touched as I am by the confrontation between Blanche's world of illusion and Stanley's cold brutality. It's the stuff of great opera. I'm Nick Reveles, and I'll see you at the opera.